I never expected that a single morning could be the quiet precursor to a storm that would forever change my life. My name is James Carter, and for as long as I can remember, my days have been defined by routine, precision, and a steadfast belief that nothing could shake the foundation of my life. I worked as a project manager for a reputable construction firm in Atlanta, and at home, my wife, Margaret, managed our well-kept house with the same care and efficiency that I applied to every project I led. Life was predictable, safe, and, I believed, built on trust. That fateful morning, however, something was different. I woke up to the sound of soft rain pattering against our windows, a welcome companion to the quiet stillness of dawn. As I sipped my strong black coffee in the kitchen, I noticed that Margaret seemed unusually quiet. Her eyes, usually alight with gentle humor, were distant as she prepared breakfast. I couldn't place it immediately. Perhaps it was just a side effect of a restless night. After all, in our household, nothing ever felt truly amiss. Before leaving for work, I glanced at the family calendar pinned to the wall. Amid neatly written appointments and reminders, one note stood out, a small scrap of paper with a single cryptic sentence: "Not all is as it seems." There was no signature, no indication of who might have left it behind. I brushed it off as an odd prank, or maybe a miscommunication with one of our neighbors. I assured myself that nothing could be more important than the regular rhythm of our days. Throughout the morning, the routine continued. I locked the door behind me as I left for the office and exchanged a quick, distracted smile with Margaret before heading to my car. At work, I buried myself in reports, blueprints, and meeting schedules. But despite the orderly pace of my day, that cryptic note lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that its message was more than a careless joke. Something was shifting imperceptibly in the background of my otherwise secure life. When the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, I returned home, expecting the comforting familiarity of our life to greet me. The house was exactly as I had left it, quiet, orderly, and welcoming. Margaret was in the living room, arranging magazines on the coffee table with the same precise care that had always impressed me. We exchanged brief greetings over dinner, a simple meal of roast chicken and steamed vegetables. And conversation, though pleasant, felt edged with an undercurrent I couldn't name. After dinner, while Margaret was reading in the next room, I found myself wandering into the study. It was a small, neatly organized space lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. I sat there for a moment, staring out the window at the darkening sky, trying to dismiss the nagging thought of the note. Life, I reminded myself, was simply too orderly to hide any real secrets. And yet, a part of me remained alert, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Over the next few days, the normal cadence of life continued, but subtle hints began to accumulate. Margaret would receive phone calls in the late afternoon and step away to speak in hushed tones, her face masked by an expression that I couldn't quite decipher. I noticed that on several evenings after dinner, she would linger in the study alone long after I had settled into my own routine in the den. I told myself it was nothing more than a quiet moment of reflection. After all, our home was a sanctuary of calm, and privacy was a cherished part of any well-run household. One particular evening, as I was unpacking a file in my office, I caught a glimpse of Margaret through the open door to the study. She was on the phone, her voice low and steady, but her eyes darted quickly toward the corridor every time she spoke. I paused and listened. The conversation was brief, a few clipped words and a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. The call ended abruptly, and she returned to the room as if nothing had happened. I couldn't tell if it was a flicker of unease in her smile or the way her hands trembled slightly when she set down her purse that made my mind race. Yet I remained silent, unwilling to disrupt the routine I had come to rely on. Days turned into a week, and I kept a careful, quiet vigil over the small inconsistencies that began to punctuate our daily lives. At work, I maintained my focus, but every time I caught a glimpse of Margaret's face in passing, or noticed a brief silence in her tone, the mysterious note echoed in my thoughts. I started to note down the times when things felt off. A pause before answering the phone, a momentary hesitation before returning to the family room. Each observation was small and could be dismissed as a fleeting anomaly in an otherwise predictable life. I had no reason to suspect anything more. My father, Robert Carter, would visit every now and then, his presence a reminder of simpler times and a strong family bond. He always brought an air of wisdom and a casual warmth that comforted me. On one such visit, while we were having a quiet conversation over coffee in the living room, I noticed Margaret's glance flit briefly toward him, a glance that lingered a moment too long before she smiled and resumed the conversation. I wondered if I was reading too much into ordinary human behavior, if my mind was overanalyzing small details that were perfectly innocent. I decided not to voice any of my suspicions. After all, trust had always been the bedrock of our marriage, and it wasn't my place to disturb the tranquility that we had worked so hard to build. Instead, I focused on my work, on the details of construction projects and deadlines that offered concrete certainty in a world that sometimes seemed too vague. Yet, in quiet moments, while driving home at dusk or watching the rain outside my office window, I couldn't help but wonder if the note was a harbinger of a deeper secret, one that lay hidden beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect life. That night, as I lay in bed, the soft hum of the air conditioner filling the silence, I replayed the day's events in my mind. The note, Margaret's whispered phone calls, the fleeting glances, it all formed a pattern too subtle to be accidental. I resolved to remain observant, to let the clues accumulate until a clearer picture emerged. I told myself that if there were any truths hidden in the fabric of our routine, they would eventually reveal themselves in due time. In the quiet darkness, I made a silent promise to myself. I would uncover the truth behind these small, inexplicable details without causing disturbance in our carefully maintained world. The calm before the storm was almost palpable, a delicate balance of normalcy and the unknown. I drifted off to sleep with a single thought echoing in my mind. Trust is not always what it seems. Little did I know that the hidden threads of deception were being woven slowly, silently, right under my very nose. And as the days unfolded, each small clue would lead me closer to a revelation that would shake the very foundations of my world. One that, when fully revealed, would leave nothing untouched. For now, however, I remained a man caught in the gentle, relentless grip of uncertainty, unaware of the turbulent tide that was steadily rising in the background of my life. The next week unfolded with the deceptive calm of a surface undisturbed by storms. Yet beneath that placid veneer, I found myself increasingly alert to the smallest of details. A hesitation in Margaret's smile, the soft murmur of hushed phone calls, and an air of secrecy that seemed to envelope her every move. Mornings remained a ritual. I would sip my coffee while watching Margaret move gracefully about the kitchen. But now, I began to notice that the way she handled her morning routine was different. Her eyes would occasionally wander toward a hallway as if expecting someone, and her laughter, though light, carried an edge I hadn't recognized before. I told myself these were nothing more than fleeting moments, quirks of daily life that could easily be explained away by fatigue or distraction. Yet, the cryptic note from that first morning, "Not all is as it seems," kept echoing in my mind. Work provided a welcome distraction. In the structured environment of my office, surrounded by the predictable hum of printers and the steady rhythm of meetings, I could almost forget the unsettling undercurrent that had crept into our home. I poured myself into every project, every new blueprint and deadline, finding solace in the hard fact of contracts and progress reports. But even amid the calculated details of my work, my thoughts drifted back to Margaret. Was it merely the stress of the job, or was there something more elusive hiding in the quiet moments we shared? That evening, as I returned home under a sky streaked with twilight, I noticed an unusual stillness around our front porch. The door, usually warmly lit and welcoming, cast a longer than normal shadow on the ground. I stepped inside and greeted Margaret in her usual calm manner, but I could see a fleeting tension in her eyes, a momentary lapse in the practiced composure that had always defined her. She excused herself to take a phone call in the study. I listened from a distance, careful not to intrude, and I heard her speak in a low, even tone. Her words were soft, measured, but laced with familiarity that made my pulse quicken. I couldn't decipher conversation, but it was enough to spark a quiet alarm within me. Over following days, a series of small anomalies began to accumulate. On several afternoons, I returned home to find Margaret in the study long after our usual evening routines. The room, with its rows of books and neatly stacked papers, had become her quiet retreat. At first, I considered that she might simply be enjoying some solitude, a reprieve from the day's demands. But a persistent pattern of her retreat, coupled with the secretive nature of her phone calls, gradually eroded the certainty I once had. I began to document these occurrences silently. The precise times when Margaret would vanish into the study, the number of phone calls she received, and even the subtle changes in her appearance, a hint of unfamiliar perfume clinging to her blouse, a slight alteration in her style. Each observation was small, almost negligible on its own, yet together they formed a mosaic of discrepancies. I carefully noted these details in a small journal, not to confront her immediately, but to create a record in case the situation escalated into something more significant. My mind, always a repository of details and schedules, began to draw connections between these subtle clues. I recalled a moment during dinner when Margaret's gaze briefly flitted toward the hallway instead of meeting my eyes, or the time when, during a quiet moment in the living room, I noticed her phone screen flash with an incoming message that she hastily dismissed before I could glimpse its content. Each instance was as fleeting as a shadow, yet too persistent to ignore. I attempted to attribute these behaviors to the inevitable changes that occur in any long marriage, a shift in priorities, a personal space claimed in silence. But the note from that first morning nagged at me, a silent reminder that appearances could be deceiving. I began to wonder if there was a hidden narrative behind the mundane, a story unfolding quietly in the background of our shared life. Even my father's visits, once a source of comfort and familiarity, took on a different quality during this period. When Robert Carter came by, his cheerful demeanor was met with a subdued response from Margaret. I noticed that during his visits, she would often excuse herself for a moment, retreating to the study as if to shield a secret from the prying eyes of our guests. I recalled one afternoon when, while Robert and I were discussing old family memories over coffee, Margaret's voice was abruptly interrupted by a hushed tone that seemed too personal to be casual conversation. I could not discern the content, but the tone left me with a lingering sense of disquiet. Late at night, when the house was finally cloaked in darkness and silence, I would lie awake with the sound of rain tapping against the windows and replaying every small detail in my mind. Was it possible that Margaret's retreat into the study, those hushed conversations, and even the unusual aroma of a cologne I didn't recognize, were the threads of a secret tapestry? I found myself questioning the reliability of the life I had so meticulously built, wondering if underneath the surface of our stable existence lay a narrative too painful to acknowledge. I resolved to keep a closer watch, not out of suspicion born of jealousy, but from a need for clarity. I made mental notes of every unusual occurrence, waiting patiently for threads of this quiet mystery to reveal a pattern that might one day explain the unsettling changes I had begun to notice. One crisp evening, as autumn leaves whispered along the sidewalk outside, I returned home earlier than usual. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of a table lamp, and I found Margaret alone in the study once more. I hesitated at the doorway, my heart pounded with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. I wanted to ask her about these late-night calls and her prolonged solitude, but something inside me urged caution. I knew that the truth, whenever it would come, must be allowed to emerge naturally rather than forced by confrontation. As I sat there in that quiet threshold, the weight of my observations pressed down on me. Every subtle sign, the lingering look, the whispered conversation, the mysterious fragrance, coalesced into an inescapable question: what was truly hidden behind the routine of our everyday life? I realized that the calm I had once trusted was beginning to fray at the edges, revealing the delicate threads of something concealed. The coming days would be a test of patience and vigilance. I continued to carry on with my daily tasks, yet every moment was now tinged with an undercurrent of uncertainty. I found solace in predictable, yet my journal of observations grew steadily, each entry a silent testament to the gradual unraveling of the familiar. Though I had no evidence to confirm my suspicions and no definitive reason to believe that our life was anything but ordinary, the small details could not be dismissed. I resolved to let the clues gather like shadows at dusk, waiting for the moment when their collective truth would emerge. And so, Even as I maintained the outward appearance of a man with his life in order, I became a quiet sentinel, watching, recording, and silently questioning the authenticity of the world I thought I knew. In that lingering week of subtle revelations, I remained steadfast, determined not to disrupt the delicate balance until I was certain. Little did I know that each quiet clue was a stepping stone to a revelation that would challenge everything I had held dear, a truth hidden deep within the confines of our home, waiting for a precise moment to shatter the calm before the inevitable storm. In the weeks that followed the quiet anomalies, the delicate balance of my one certain world began to show signs of disintegration. Every day at home became a series of subtle shifts, each one chipping away at the facade of the stable marriage I had so confidently relied on. I maintained my routine, leaving for work on time, returning the evenings to a well-ordered house. But now my mind was constantly alert to details that I had once dismissed. One crisp morning, as I was preparing to leave for the office, I noticed Margaret's purse resting on the kitchen counter in an unusual way, its zipper partially open, as if hastily grabbed. I paused, glancing around for an explanation, but the house was silent and undisturbed. Margaret's smile, warm yet fleeting, did little to dispel the nagging uncertainty that had become my constant companion. At work, the steady hum of routine provided a temporary escape from the questions that had begun to plague my thoughts. I focused on blueprints and project deadlines, yet every so often a memory would intrude, a half-heard conversation, the sight of a misplaced object, or the lingering scent of an unfamiliar cologne that seemed to hover in our home. I made a discreet note of these moments in a small journal kept in my desk drawer, each entry a quiet testament to a growing disquiet I could no longer ignore. That evening, I returned home earlier than usual. The sky was overcast, and a cool breeze accompanied my drive. I found the house in its usual order. Margaret appeared calm as she greeted me with a gentle smile. But as I set my keys on the entry table, I noticed a subtle detail, a set of receipts from a boutique hotel, neatly tucked inside a folder on the coffee table. They were dated within the last few days, and though I recalled no such expense or event in our schedule, they seemed to carry an air of mystery that I couldn't easily dismiss. Over dinner, I attempted to engage Margaret in casual conversation. I asked about her day, about the quiet hours she spent in the study, but her answers were brief and measured. When I mentioned the receipts indirectly, "I found some unexpected papers on the table today." She paused for a fraction of a second longer than usual before replying with a dismissive laugh. I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes darted away, as if she were hiding something behind that carefully crafted smile. Later that night, as I moved from the living room to my study, I passed by the slightly ajar door of Margaret's private retreat, the study that had become her sanctuary over the past several weeks. I could hear a soft murmur of conversation from within, but I assumed it was a routine phone call or a quiet moment of reflection. I didn't knock, knowing well that she valued her privacy. Yet, as I listened, I caught a faint echo of laughter that sounded too familiar, a tone that I had heard before in voices close to home, voices I had trusted. The following day, my routine took on an even more unsettling cast. In the early morning hours, as I sipped coffee and scanned the newspaper at the kitchen table, I noticed an unfamiliar perfume lingering in the air, a fragrance that was neither Margaret's nor one I recognized from any of my own belongings. I searched the room, trying to pinpoint its origin. The scent seemed to be coming from the study door, slightly open as it had been for days now. I made a mental note to pay closer attention, wondering if the small detail was another piece of the puzzle. In the midst of my growing vigilance, a new clue emerged that shook the quiet monotony of our lives. One afternoon, while helping Margaret rearrange some books in the study, a task she insisted on doing herself, I saw, almost accidentally, a glimpse of a photograph tucked behind a stack of folders on her desk. It was a candid shot, capturing Margaret in the embrace of an older man whose face was partly obscured. The setting was intimate, a familiar dining room, warm light spilling over them, and Margaret's expression was soft and affectionate. I couldn't tell who he was from the angle of the photograph, but his presence stirred something deep within me, a dissonant note in the symphony of my life. I tucked the photo away in my pocket, my pulse quickening as I realized that every little detail was adding up to a narrative I had never anticipated. That night, I sat in the quiet of our living room, the sound of rain pattering softly against the windows, and spread out my journal on the coffee table. Page after page, I had recorded every unusual event. The open zipper on the purse, the unexpected receipts, the faint, unrecognized cologne, and now the mysterious photograph. Each entry was a silent whisper of betrayal, yet none of it formed a clear picture, only fragments of secret that lurked just beyond my grasp. The next morning, as I left for work, I resolved to be even more observant. I would note every unexplained pause in Margaret's conversation, every furtive glance towards the study. I began to time her departure from the room and mark the durations of her phone calls. I wasn't seeking to pry unnecessarily. I only needed to understand if these anomalies were isolated incidents or parts of a deliberate pattern. One afternoon, while I was in the garage organizing some tools, I heard Margaret's voice raise in a low, urgent conversation from the study. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, intimate and laden with meaning. My hands trembled slightly as I leaned against the doorframe, silently listening. The conversation ended abruptly, leaving a heavy silence that resonated in the air. I waited a few moments before stepping away, my mind racing with unspoken questions. At dinner that evening, Margaret tried to engage in light conversation, but I could sense an undercurrent of tension in her words. I remarked casually on the beautiful weather, but she only responded with a tight smile, her eyes flickering with a hint of something I couldn't name. The sense of foreboding that haunted me since that first morning now loomed larger, a silent specter in every gesture and pause. After dinner, as the household settled into its customary quiet, I retreated to my study with my journal and the photograph safely stowed away. I spent the next hour reviewing my notes, aligning the events like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Each observation, though minute, seemed to lead me toward a hidden truth, a secret that, if revealed, might upend everything I had built. I knew I had to be cautious. The foundation of our life was at stake, and I was determined to uncover the truth without precipitating a confrontation that might tear our world apart before I was ready to understand it fully. That night, as I lay awake in the dark, I reflected on the growing weight of these accumulated clues. The mystery of the open purse, the receipts from an unknown hotel, the strange perfume, the hushed conversations, and the photograph, all of it pointed toward something concealed in the depths of our home, something that Margaret was guarding carefully. I was a man who had always valued order and trust, and yet I found myself adrift in a sea of uncertainty. I resolved in the coming days I would keep a tighter watch on the study and the subtle signals that now filled our quiet home. I would remain vigilant, recording each anomaly until the threads of the secret came together in a pattern too clear to ignore. With every small detail documented, I felt the promise of revelation, a truth that, while it might shatter the life I knew, was essential to reclaiming control of my future. In that silent vigil, as the night deepened and the rain fell steadily against the window panes, I came to understand that nothing in life is ever truly as it seems. The calm of our days had been a carefully constructed illusion, and now, in the unrelenting shadow of doubt, I was beginning to see the cracks in its foundation. Each subtle clue was a whisper of betrayal, and the mounting evidence hinted at a secret that lay at the very heart of our marriage, a secret that would soon force me to confront a reality I had never imagined. The morning after the confrontation felt as though time itself had slowed to a painful crawl. I awoke to a house that no longer resembled the one I once knew. Every corner, every familiar piece of furniture, now seemed to hold memories of deception and betrayal. I had spent that long, sleepless night processing the explosive truth. Margaret had been having an affair with my father, Robert Carter. The discovery had shattered every illusion of trust one had so carefully built around our marriage. I sat at the kitchen table, the silence around me as heavy as a stone that now seemed to weigh on my chest. There was no dramatic outburst this morning, only a raw, unyielding quiet that filled every room. Margaret had left early, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she departed without a word. My father had retreated to his study, his face drawn and void of the warmth he once effortlessly conveyed. It was clear that, as a family, we had all been forced to confront a truth too devastating to ignore. I spent the early hours of the day sifting through the tangible evidence I had gathered over weeks. The receipts, the photograph, every hushed conversation, and every unexplained detail. Now, every item was a stark reminder of the betrayal that had been lurking beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect life. The routine of our days had been nothing but a finely honed performance, one designed to hide the dark undercurrents of our existence. At midday, I arranged a meeting with both Margaret and my father in the living room, the heart of our home, where so many happy memories once lived. The room was unervingly quiet as I took my place at one end of the long oak table, my eyes fixed on the two figures who had once been pillars of my life. There was no dramatic tirade, no raised voices, only the weight of undeniable facts. "Margaret, Robert," I began, my voice steady but low, "we need to address what has come to light." I laid out the evidence on the table, each piece a quiet indictment of our shared history. The receipts from the hotel, the photograph of Margaret in an intimate embrace, the recordings of whispered conversations. Everything was there, unambiguous and unyielding. Margaret's face went pale as she regarded the items, her eyes avoiding mine. My father, usually so composed, looked stricken with regret. There was no defiance, no attempt at denial, only a heavy, sorrowful acceptance that what had happened could not be undone. The atmosphere in the room was electric with an intensity that defied words, as if every silent second carried the weight of 1,000 broken promises. I spoke again, each word deliberate. "I trusted you both with everything. I believed in the integrity of our family. Now I see that trust was built on a lie. The words were not meant to wound for the sake of inflicting pain. They were simply a reflection of truth that had been waiting to be acknowledged." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "James," she whispered, "I never meant for this to happen. I lost myself." Her voice was quiet, void of any dramatic plea, as if she were explaining an unfortunate misstep rather than a deep betrayal. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the silence between us stretching out as we each grappled with the magnitude of what had been revealed. There was no immediate solution offered, no grand reconciliation or promises of a fresh start. Instead, we sat in that living room, three people bound together by a history that had just been irrevocably altered. I knew then that nothing would ever return to the way it had been. Our home, our family, had been shattered by secrets too deep to ever be fully uncovered or forgiven. After that day, the routine of our lives fractured beyond repair. Margaret moved out to a small apartment in a quiet part town. My father, burdened by his own remorse, left our home for extended periods, seeking refuge in solitude away from the reminders of his betrayal. I found myself alone in a large house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, now haunted by silence and the echoes of what had been lost. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to piece together my own existence from the remnants of shattered trust. I did not seek to dive deep into my emotions or analyze every nuance of betrayal. There was no need for psychological introspection when the facts were plain as day. Instead, I focused on the tangible, the restructuring of my day-to-day life, the careful recalibration of boundaries, and the relentless drive to reclaim the control I had lost. I returned to work with a new determination. In the methodical routine of construction projects, deadlines, and meetings, I found a semblance of order, a way to keep the overwhelming chaos at bay. Every morning, I arrived at the office with quiet resolve to rebuild what had been broken, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, deliberate actions that reaffirmed my independence. The routine that had once been the foundation of my life was now the tool I used to forge a path forward, even if that path was steeped in loss. Late one evening, as I sat alone in the study, the same room where so many secrets had once been hidden, I wrote down a simple sentence on a fresh sheet of paper. The truth has been unveiled. I did not embellish it with regret or sorrow. It was merely a statement of fact. In that moment, I made a silent vow that I would not allow the betrayal to define me. I would honor the lessons learned by moving forward with a clear-eyed determination to build a future unburdened by the past. Months passed, and slowly, I began to notice small signs of renewal. I started meeting old friends again, exploring new hobbies, and even taking solitary trips to rediscover what it meant to live without the constant undercurrent of betrayal. I kept my life orderly, my days structured around the simplicity of honest work and routine interactions. The memories of that fateful period remained, but they were no longer the sole focus of my existence. There were days when I would catch myself glancing at the family photograph on the mantel, a picture of happier times, and feel a twinge of longing for what was lost. Yet each time I would remind myself that the pursuit of truth, no matter how painful, was the only path to genuine healing. I had learned that life's calm is often an illusion, masking undercurrents of secrets that can one day erupt without warning. And while I could not change the past, I could control how I moved forward. The journey was not one of dramatic transformation, but a steady, deliberate steps, a series of measured actions that slowly reasserted my control over my own destiny. I did not seek to reconcile with Margaret or my father. That chapter had closed irreversibly. Instead, I chose to focus on the practical, rebuilding trust in myself and in the world around me through the certainty of my everyday routine. In time, the echoes of betrayal began to fade into a quiet background noise, a reminder of a past that no longer held power over me. The pain remained, a scar etched deep beneath the surface, but it was no longer a wound that defined my every moment. I had reclaimed my life, not with the theatricality of a grand epiphany, but with the steady perseverance of a man determined to move on. Now, as I look out at the calm skyline from my office window, I see a future that is uncertain yet filled with the promise of new beginnings. The storm of betrayal had swept through my life with relentless force, leaving behind a landscape forever altered. Yet, in that altered terrain, I found the strength to forge ahead, one day, one routine, one quiet act of defiance at a time. The final reckoning was not an explosion of emotions or a dramatic fall from grace. It was a slow, steady acceptance of truth and a deliberate decision to live on despite it. I had learned that even in the face of unimaginable betrayal, one can rebuild, redefine, and reclaim the simple order that makes life bearable. And so, with each passing day, I continue on this uncertain road, armed with the knowledge that while trust may be shattered, the will to rebuild can be even stronger.